The Archean is the second eon in Earth's geologic history. It spans 1.5 billion years between the Hadean and Proterozoic eons. This time was filled with a number of significant geologic and biological events. And although the Earth's surface was still dominated by largely mafic and ultramafic volcanism, we see the first sedimentary rocks in Archean strata. And these are significant because they represent the superficial erosion of the small but building continents that were forming around the world. The environment on the Earth's surface would have been totally different from that of today. The atmosphere filled with high concentrations of methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, and very little, if any, oxygen. The moon would have orbited more closely to the Earth and appeared much larger in the sky. The Earth's spin was even greater back then, producing days that were much shorter, as short as 21 hours or less. But it really was the appearance of life. Exactly when, we still are trying to figure out, and we may never know exactly when, but certainly by about 3.5 billion years ago, life was starting to take hold on Earth. We see the first signs of life in the form of fossils in some cherts in Australia. And these life forms occupied shallow marine environments, but also hot springs and geothermal vents. These are cyanobacteria, more commonly known as stromatolites, in present-day Shark Bay, Australia. So these are modern analogs to what existed back during the Archean. Indeed, cyanobacteria has been around for billions of years and may be the longest living life form in Earth's history. Simple microscopic life that has lasted billions of years. We will look at the development of the continents during this 1.5 billion year eon, but also the appearance of life and its development as well. The Archean Eon spans the time period of 4,000 million to 2,500 million, so 1,500 million years of Earth's history. Here's a geologic time pie diagram, and you can see the Archean occupying about a third of Earth's history, from the Hadean, Archean, Proterozoic, and then the Phanerozoic. So the Archean is similar in length to the Proterozoic. It's a little bit shorter. And Archean means in Greek beginning or origins, and the Archean Eon itself actually was the first eon in geologic history, followed by the Proterozoic and Phanerozoic. So there used to be three. But of late, we've informally recognized the Hadean and split it out from the Archean. And so it's its own eon in its own right now. So the Archean is now the second eon of geologic time. This is taken from the ICS geologic time scale, showing the Hadean eon itself down here from 4,600 to 4,000, and then the Archean spans the next 1.5 billion years of time, and then following that is the Proterozoic. All of this is included in what's called the Precambrian. So the Archean can be split into smaller chunks of time we call eras. The eon is the largest, but then the next smaller unit of time is the era, and there's 4 in the Archean: the Eo, Paleo, Meso, and Neo. These have nice round number boundary ages between 4,000 and 3,600, that's 400 million years, and then another 400 million years down to 3,200, and then another 400 years down to 2,800, and then 300 million years down to 2,500. This is the official time scale, the Eo, Paleo, Meso, and Neo-Archean. The late heavy bombardment is a significant solar system event that occurred in the latest part of the Hadean Eon and into the earliest Archean. Roughly a few hundred million years between 4,100 and 3,800 is when this event is thought to have occurred. It really is a period of increased impact activity in the inner solar system. In fact, it was a rearrangement of the solar system, as we'll talk about in a second. and this greatly affected the inner planets, including Earth. The 4 terrestrial planets, Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, all show signs of impacts related to this event. On the moon itself, the large multi-ring basins largely formed during this period of time. So large impacts causing multi-ring basins, and then they fill in with lava, and that's the dark regions you see on the moon. Well, these multi-ring basins also would have occurred on Earth, and since Earth has greater mass, it likely had a larger proportion of these kind of impacts. And so multi-ring basins that formed on the moon likely were forming on the Earth as well, filling with mafic lava, perhaps much like that occurred on the moon. The thing with the Earth, though, is that tectonics and erosion are the great erasers of geological evidence. But these features are preserved on the moon, and since we've been there and we've collected the rock samples, we have some fairly good idea of when these structures were formed from the isotopic dating. Mercury has features like this too. The giant Caloris Basin is the largest impact basin on Mercury, probably formed during this time. We know that Venus rotates backward. It's called retrograde rotation. Well, why would this be? Most planets should form from the solar nebula, and they should form with the same rotational spin. But Venus is different, and we think that possibly during this late heavy bombardment, it was impacted by a protoplanet or a planetesimal, which set its spin a different direction. Mars has an equally large impact basin called the Hellas Basin. So these features are present on all the terrestrial planets. To explain this is something called the Nice model. It's not nice, but it's Nice, named after the city in the southern coast of France where this model was ultimately presented. And we think that it was caused by the orbital changes of the giant outer planets. The model itself is summarized in this diagram here. As of the beginning of the solar system, the planets had formed, and there was a lot of debris in the solar system being swept up by the planets, and we talked about that in the Hadean. Over time, the 2 largest of the planets, Jupiter and Saturn, every 2 times Jupiter goes around the sun would equal 1 time that Saturn would go around the sun. So they would more or less be in the same place at the same time. Well, it took a little while for this to develop, but we think by around 4,100 million this had taken place. And what that does is it gives a gravitational push to the surrounding areas. What that did is affect the 2 next to larger planets, Neptune and Uranus. And it's thought that Neptune actually orbited closer to the sun than Uranus at the time. But Jupiter and Saturn affected those planets so that they actually switched positions to where they are today. So by 3.5 billion, the outer planets had settled into their present orbital lanes. Well, during this few 100 million years of time when this was getting sorted out, all the rocky and icy objects of the inner and middle solar system were being pushed around, either ejected out of the solar system to the outer reaches, which would become what's known as the Kuiper Belt and Oort cloud, or into the inner solar system where they would ultimately be devoured by the sun. And on their way into the inner solar system, they would be impacting the terrestrial planets. Indeed, much of that material was then captured gravitationally by Jupiter and occupies the area between Mars and Jupiter, the asteroid belt. So we think that the solar system acquired its present structure during this time around 4 billion years ago. So in the early part of the Archean, the planets experienced a pulse of impact activity related to the gravitational sorting out of the giant planets. Let's talk a little about greenstone belts. And these are very important geologic terrains that are largely Precambrian in age. They include areas of granite and gneiss separated from each other by greenstone. If you remember your metamorphic rock lecture, greenstone is basically a metamorphosed basalt. Metamorphosed mafic volcanic like basalt, when they're metamorphosed to a certain grade of metamorphism give you greenstone. And the green color is coming from the metamorphic mineral chlorite, which is the green mica, essentially. This shows a map of the Barberton greenstone belt in South Africa. In pink here, these are granitic intrusive rocks, and in red are more plutonic rocks. And in green and tan, these are metasedimentary rocks and greenstone. The Onverwacht group, the fig tree, and the Moodles group, these are all the greenstones and even metasedimentary rocks that are positioned in between these areas of plutonic rocks. This is in South Africa, in the Kapval Craton, as it's called. So here's a stratigraphic column of this area. The metavolcanic and metasedimentary rocks are shown here. The Onverwacht group includes largely ultramafic volcanic rocks, especially towards the bottom, with a little bit of felsic volcanic rocks, and then as you go upward, you get more mafic volcanics. So komatiites in the lower half, basalts in the upper half, with intervening layers of chert and felsic volcanics. Then the fig tree group and the Moodles group are almost exclusively sedimentary in origin. So sandstones and conglomerates in yellow, and the darker brown there is shale and mudstone. There's a little bit of sedimentary down here in the form of chert, but a lot more at the top. That's the stratigraphic structure. Okay, mostly ultramafic and mafic lavas, and then the younger parts are usually sedimentary. The significance of these greenstone belts, they likely represent initial plate tectonic processes. Exactly when plate tectonics first started, we don't really know. It's kind of hard to pin that down. Here's a geologic timescale which shows different estimates of when we think plate tectonics actually began, and most of them are in the Archean. In fact, all the way back into the middle part of the Hadean. Plate tectonics, as we know it today, probably got its start sometime in the early part of the Archean. What it was like might have been a little bit different, though. It might have been more vertical in nature, where you had material moving up and down, kind of buoyancy driven, where you have more of a homogeneous surface, which is mostly oceanic crust, mostly mafic and ultramafic, with tiny little continental nuclei of felsic material. It's really heat driven, a lot of heat flow, and so a lot of convection, something more vertical in nature. Then today's plate tectonics is more horizontal. So you have plates coming together, plates moving apart, plates sliding by each other. That's more of a horizontal type of tectonics. Of course, you have subduction of denser oceanic plates beneath overriding plates. So there's some amount of vertical component to today's tectonics as well. But we think that back at the beginning, it might have been more vertical in nature. And this is still being modeled and debated and worked out. This diagram here shows a typical plate tectonic cross-section of different boundary settings. And you can see oceanic lithospheric plate subducting underneath a more continental plate with the granites and tonalites. And then there's a sedimentary basin here, which might have some mafic volcanics as well. So tectonics bringing this terrain together with this terrain, they're colliding, and you're getting metamorphism. And over time, these rocks are changing from basalts into metabasalts, and these sediments into metasediments. Even after erosion exposes these over billions of years later, we can see these granitic terrains, which represent little continental nuclei, and then these greenstone belts, which are the areas of mafic volcanics and sediments. Greenstone belts are found all over the planet. There are dozens located on every continent, and important ones include ones in Greenland and Canada, the Isua greenstone belt, along with the Amitsoq and Aquilia terrains. These have an age of about 3.8 billion, and these terrains here used to be the oldest known rocks on Earth. Since we have found older rocks in northwest Canada in the Slave Province, and that's the Acasta gneiss and the Acasta greenstone belt. Now, a little bit farther southeast in the Hudson Bay region, the Nuvuagitic greenstone belt includes rocks that are 3.8, 3.9. It was initially thought they were actually Hadean in age, about 4.2 or so, but that has been walked back a little bit. So they're similar in age to the Isua and Amitsoq and Aquilia rocks in Greenland. We also see these greenstone belts in Africa, the Barberton greenstone belt, and Australia as well, with the Pilbara region having a greenstone belt there too. These are all similar in age, with Iswa and Nuvuagitic being about 3.8 and Pilbara being about 3.6 to 3.2 and Barberton about 3.6 to 3.1 billion years old. So they're all Archean in age. This shows Nuvuagitic. You can see it's up in the Arctic tundra there. It's all been cleared off by glaciation and nicely exposed. That's around the Hudson Bay region right here. This is South Africa, totally different environment, and the Barberton greenstone belt in South Africa kind of looks like that. There are roughly 36 areas of Archean lithosphere exposed worldwide. This map shows where they are, and every continent has exposures of Archean rocks. The Archean cratons here that represent the nucleus of any given continent. North America has several different Archean cratons that were assembled together to build the larger North American craton. These represent areas of ancient, stable continental crust, where you had buoyant granitic and intermediate plutonic rocks that would not get subducted, and so once they were created, they would persist and eventually collide with other continental nuclei to form larger features. So this is how plate tectonics has developed the present day distribution of continents. Every continent today is made up of smaller pieces which were assembled over time, and much of this assembly occurred during the Archean and Proterozoic eons. Modern day cratons, like the North American craton or South American, are typically built on these older, smaller cratonic areas. I use the word supercraton where there are a number of discrete cratons that have been put together to form something larger. And so a craton would be one discrete area of Precambrian rock, and a supercraton is where you can actually see a number of different pieces put together. North America, for example, includes the Slave craton, which is the oldest, then the Superior, the Wyoming, the Nain. These are all different cratons of slightly different age that were assembled at different times to form what is now North America. South America, the Archean terrain down there has a name. It's called Amazonia. In Europe, the East European craton forms much of Western Asia or Europe. The Kapval craton in South Africa. The Yilgarn and Pilbara cratons are two smaller ones in Australia. Let's talk for a second about the North American craton. Present day North American craton is made up of several smaller, older cratonic fragments. And these range in age from the oldest one, which is the Slave craton, which has an age of about 4,000 million or so, so late Hadean to early Archean. There's the widespread Superior craton, which is an age of about 3,800 million years. And then there's the younger Wyoming craton, which is about 3,600 million years. Each one of these was its own separate, discrete continental nucleus, which at some point in the past came together with another one to form something larger. For example, the Slave craton merged with the Ray craton, and when that happened, you had an orogeny, an orogenic event, which was caused by the collision, the convergence of these small continental pieces. There are a number of different orogenies that were involved in the assembly of the present-day North American craton. In orange here, these are cratonic areas that are Archean in age. In green, these are Proterozoic cratonic pieces. And then in yellow, these are younger rocks. Today, when we look at the North American craton, we don't see all this. This is inferred especially in the United States portion, it's covered by younger rocks. It's inferred from exposed mountainous areas and drill cores and things like that. This is a geologic map of North America, and all the blues and greens and yellows are younger Phanerozoic rocks, which cover the older Precambrian rocks. Just bits and pieces exposed in the western United States. Where we see most of these rocks exposed is in Canada, and the exposed portion of the North American craton is called the Canadian Shield. It's been exposed largely by glacial activity over the last several 100,000 years. A supercraton, as I've mentioned before, is a collection of two or more smaller cratons forming something larger. We think Earth's first supercraton was Valbara. And Valbara formed maybe as early as 3,600 million years ago and survived until maybe 2,800 million years ago. Valbara is made up of two cratonic nuclei, one from South Africa, the Kapval craton, and one from Western Australia, the Pilbara craton. So these two come together and form something larger. This shows three of the models we have that explains kind of how the fragments came together. There's some limitations on what we can say where the pieces were. We can kind of say what latitude they're at. You can see they're all pretty much at the same latitude, but the longitude we don't really have as much control over. So that explains why these look a little bit different. Regardless, the Pilbara craton from Australia and the Kapval craton from South Africa came together and formed something larger, and we creatively called it the Kapval Pilbara craton. No, we called it Valbara. And that is possibly what you would call Earth's first supercontinent. Well, I use the word supercontinent reluctantly, especially in this case, because it's so tiny compared to even one continent of today. So really a supercontinent in my mind is something large like Pangaea or even Rodinia, which we'll talk about later. That's why I use the word supercraton, because it doesn't carry that overarching significance supercontinent. So it's a collection of continental pieces, cratonic pieces, but it doesn't really have any size limit. So certainly the first supercratons were smaller, and as time progressed, they would merge with other pieces to form even larger supercratons. The next supercraton to form is called and formed anywhere from about 3,000 million years ago. So it survived to about 2,800. You notice that this kind of overlaps with the Valbara supercraton. It's because they're made of similar fragments. Itself, the name, comes from German. It's a prefix that means original, because we thought that this was the first original supercontinent. But since we've hypothesized that there was an earlier one, and we've called that Valbara. This one is a little bit bigger. You can see it's a little bit bigger in extent than Valbara. It's made of the Kapval and Pilbara cratons, which is what Valbara was, but we've included more from Africa, from India, the Yilgarn craton from Australia, and several little ones from East Antarctica, all coming together to form this slightly larger supercontinent, if you will, that is Archean in age. Really, we could have called it Valbara Plus, because it's basically Valbara with a few more cratonic pieces added to it. Again, supercontinent seems a little bit of an overreach for this, but given what Earth was like then, this was the biggest game in town. So the second of Earth's supercontinents. Well, there's a third major Archean supercraton, and it's called Kenorland. And Kenorland is the youngest of the three, maybe 2,700 million years down to about 2,400. So latest Archean into the early Proterozoic. And this one is relatively large compared to what came before. So you could call this a real supercontinent. It's relatively large in size. And it combines most of the supercraton with the slave craton, superior craton, and northern Europe craton. So superior, we think, occupied the northern part, the northern European, the Karelia Kola craton here. Here is what we were calling Yilgarn and Kapval and others, and Pilbara. Superior and slave and and all that in a north to south orientation possibly, but much larger than the preceding supercraton. So this was actually worthy of the name supercontinent. Really the third in the cycle of supercratons. Here's a reconstruction of what we might have seen back in the time, and notice the ocean floor here, shallow ocean with some green material there and bubbles coming off. Wonder what that could be. Anyway, now we're getting into the Proterozoic. So in the Archean, we've had 3 supercratons, Valbara, and Kenorland. If we're going to talk about Archean rocks, we have to talk about Banded Iron Formation. And this is certainly a Dr. Bob favorite. Why? Because they're so cool looking. It's a typical banded iron formation sample, and it's made up of darker chert layers and silvery gray layers that are more iron rich. A BIF, if you will. Banded iron formations actually come in 2 different ages, some that are more Archean and some that are more Proterozoic. So there's an older variety of banded iron formations, and then some that are dominantly Proterozoic in age, younger. There are different kinds that we can describe, and one is called the Algoman type, and this is specifically Archean in age. These are formed, we think, in submarine settings, where you have a hydrothermal vent, some kind of volcanic vent on the seafloor that's spewing out very hot water that is filled with dissolved minerals in there. So hydrothermal, hot water. The dissolved minerals could be silica and other things. And the pH of this water might be different than the surrounding seawater. The pH here is alkaline. There's a certain pH that's different from the more acidic seawater. The composition of the surrounding seawater might be different as well. There might be more iron dissolved in the water. And so when these 2 fluids come together, the hydrothermal fluid and the seawater, there's a chemical reaction that takes place that causes the precipitation not only of the iron from the seawater, but the silica from the hydrothermal fluid. So the iron from the seawater forms the iron-rich layers, and the silica from the hydrothermal fluid forms the chert. And then it falls to the seafloor and forms this layered sequence we call BIF. There's a couple different models that can explain this that are slightly different in their chemical reactions and how they take place. But the overall dynamic is such that we think BIFs are formed from hydrothermal vents on the seafloor, commonly known as black smokers, and it's in a submarine setting, and there's not a whole lot of oxygen. Notice that there's not a whole lot of free oxygen in these chemical reactions. It's because oxygen wasn't prevalent during the Archean. That's why this rock is still gray in color. With the addition of oxygen, chert with the iron in it gets oxidized to a reddish color, which is my favorite. Red colored chert is called jasper. The atmosphere on Earth during the Archean was a little bit different than today, as I mentioned. To explain the environmental conditions, we have to start with the sun. And during the Archean, we think that the sun was about 75 to 80% as bright as it is today. So that's actually a huge difference. So the sun was fainter back then, and if it was fainter, the less solar radiation, the planet was probably cooler. And so how did liquid water exist? How come Earth wasn't frozen? Well, this idea is called the faint young sun paradox. The fact that Earth should have been cold, yet there's evidence of liquid water all the way back into the Hadean. Remember the zircons that indicate some kind of water-rich environment as early as 4.4 billion. If the sun was so dim, then how did liquid water exist on the planet? Well, this diagram here is loaded, and this explains the faint young sun paradox. Over here is temperature, and this is the geologic time scale starting from the beginning. Here's the Hadean, here's the Archean, Proterozoic, and then the Phanerozoic. And so it shows in red the luminosity of the sun, basically the brightness, and this is its measure right here. And so back in the Archean, we think that it was 75 to 80% of what it is today. 100% is today. It's actually, the sun is getting brighter by about 10% every 1.1 billion years or so. Here's the temperature scale. Here's the freezing point of water. So everything down here is frozen water, that's water ice, and here's liquid water. If Earth had no atmosphere, as the sun warmed up, basically this would be the temperature on the surface. It would be all below the blue line, and so no liquid water at any time. But as we know, Earth does have an atmosphere. The temperature expected on Earth with the present composition of its atmosphere, here's what it would look like. There would have been no liquid water up until about 1.7 billion years ago or so during the Proterozoic, and then it would have got warm enough for liquid water. Well, we don't think that was the case either. This gray area shows what we think the actual temperatures are like on Earth. There's a range, but all above freezing. We've had liquid water on the planet, we think, the whole time. So how is this possible if the sun started so dim and has been getting brighter? How did water remain liquid during this portion of Earth's history, during the Hadean and Archean? That's the paradox. The idea is that the composition of the atmosphere back during the Archean and Hadean was different. The secondary atmosphere the Earth had was dominantly methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide. These are greenhouse gases. Indeed, sometimes they're even called super greenhouse gases, because the incoming ultraviolet radiation is being scattered by the gas molecules, and the radiation is trying to escape, but it's longer wavelength infrared, and that radiation is being trapped by the gas molecules. And this is the greenhouse effect. These abundant greenhouse gases are trapping the solar radiation and serving to keep the planet warm. So our thermal atmospheric blanket back in the Archean was much more efficient than the one we have today, which is mostly nitrogen and oxygen. There's just a fraction of a percent of methane and carbon dioxide and ammonia. Totally different than it was back then. So we think this is what kept the planet warm while the sun slowly produced more and more radiation. Back in the Archean, there was no free atmospheric oxygen. It was all these other gases, methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide. The Archean is the eon where we first start to see life, but it's simple and prokaryotic. Life forms like this, they lack a membrane-bound nucleus. So the DNA is free-floating within the cell versus a eukaryotic cell, which is a membrane-bound nucleus with the chromosomes and DNA material. And around it is an area with various organelles that perform different functions. That's a eukaryotic cell. So this didn't exist at first. We only had the simplest prokaryotic version. Archean life is dominantly represented by extremophiles. These are members of domains Archaea and bacteria that live in relatively diverse and extreme environments, at least relative to what a typical carbon-based life form is used to. For example, a deep sea hydrothermal vent is surrounded by a number of different life forms, including chemosynthetic bacteria. These microscopic bacteria are living off of the chemical and heat energy provided by that hydrothermal vent. There are a number of different categories of extremophiles, and they are largely classified based on their environment in which they exist. For example, a thermophile is one that can tolerate relatively high heat. This would be a hot spring, like at Grand Prismatic Spring in Yellowstone National Park, or submarine hydrothermal vents. Halophiles are ones that can tolerate high salt content, say of a brine pool, much like here at Searles Lake in California. That reddish color is imparted to the water and the salt by tiny little bacteria which live in that brine. Methanogens are organisms that actually produce methane, microscopic anaerobic organisms. And there are a number of other types of extremophiles, including ones that live in ice, in very cold environments, in very dry environments, ones without oxygen, ones that can survive extreme radiation. Many of these extremophiles that we see today are likely analogs for life that existed during the earliest Archean and later. Cyanobacteria are members of domain bacteria, and these are photosynthetic. So there are different kinds of cyanobacteria. Some are filamentous, some are smaller, more pill-shaped. They take different forms, but fundamentally they're all the same in that they're photosynthetic. These have also been commonly referred to as blue-green algae. So you might see that term quite a bit. Structures that are composed of cyanobacteria are known as stromatolites. These take different forms, but they typically start as accumulations of the filaments forming mats in shallow water environments. It might be a tide pool near the ocean, it might be shallow marine setting, it might be a lake. But over time, those mats become covered with sediment, but the cyanobacteria continues to grow through the sediment and form another layer. And then over time, then this layer gets buried and then it grows through that, and you get this alternating sequence of layers. And as it grows, it'll take on different shapes. So from a flat mat, it can grow into more of a dome shape or even a small pillar over time. We see these today growing in places like Shark Bay, Australia, but we also see structures very similar to these modern stromatolites in the rock record. And this is an example of a stromatolite that's almost 3.5 billion years old from Western Australia. Stromatolites take on a variety of different shapes and sizes, and we find various structures in the rock record, like these domal structures. So you're looking down on a bedding plane here. So these are fairly broad stromatolite domes versus another typical exposure of stromatolites here, a cross-section of more columnar stromatolites. So these are individual stromatolites here. Different factors control the shape of a stromatolite, but one major factor is water depth. And we find that today the deeper water stromatolites are more conical in shape, and as water depth decreases, they become more domal, much wider and broader, and as water depth decreases even more, they become more columnar. And in places like Shark Bay, Australia, and tidal basins and such, it's common to find highly columnar stromatolites. Earth's oldest life forms are Archean in age. About 3.5 billion are the oldest directly known, undisputed remains of fossilized life, and these are found in Western Australia. There's two rock formations that hold these oldest fossils. One is the Dresser Formation, and this rock unit includes stromatolites, and these were recently discovered, and these have an age of 3481 megaannum, 3.48 billion, if you will. The other rock formation is the Apex Chert, and it's slightly younger, and so 3460 megaannum. This rock unit includes a suite of bacterial microfossils, and it's from the same region. So this is the oldest known macroscopic and microscopic fossilized life. However, we do find suggestions of life in even older rocks. If you go to the Isua province of Greenland, you can find chemical fossils, carbon tracers that might have been biogenic in origin, that would have an age of maybe 3.7 billion or so. And in the New-Vuajitic greenstone belt, there are possible microscopic fossils there that are about 3.8 billion. And this shows a reddish chert that has possible microfossils in it. And so the oldest known life is about 3.5 billion from these two Western Australia exposures. But life possibly existed before, and it's really being debated right now and worked out. So somewhere between 3.5 and 3.8 possibly is the oldest known life.